Beijing, May 2012. 18,000 people are on their feet. A bronze statue is being unveiled outside the Olympic basketball arena. Dennis Rodman is giving a speech. The crowd is chanting a name not in English, but the meaning is unmistakable. The name they're chanting is Stephon Marbury. 3 years earlier, that same man was alone in a dark room somewhere in America, live streaming himself to strangers on the internet, crying, eating Vaseline. A man who had made over $150 million in the NBA reduced to a punchline. The internet laughed. The media shook their heads. Another cautionary tale about a gifted athlete who threw it all away. That's the story most people know. But here's what they didn't tell you. This isn't a story about ego, or money, or wasted talent. This is a story about what happens when a system built to use you never bothers to catch you when you fall. This is traded away, sued by his own team and fled to China, Stephon Marbury's Unraveling. To understand what happened to Stephon Marbury, you have to understand where he came from. Not just Brooklyn, not just New York, Coney Island. In the 1980s and early 90s, Coney Island wasn't the tourist destination people romanticize. It was a neighborhood at the bottom of every economic ladder that mattered. Crumbling housing projects, unemployment, drugs moving through the same playgrounds where kids were supposed to be playing basketball. For the families living there, the American dream wasn't an aspiration, it was a rumor. Something that happened to other people, somewhere else. The Marbury family had 6 children. Don Marbury, the father, worked hard. Ida, the mother, held everything together. And all 4 of the older Marbury boys, Eric, Donnie, Norman, and Marlon, played basketball. Not recreationally, seriously, with intent. Each one of them had real talent. Each one of them came close. None of them made it. By the time Stephon Xavier Marbury was old enough to dribble a ball, the family already had a plan. An unspoken one, but a plan nonetheless. The youngest boy was different. Faster, sharper. His handles were something people stopped to watch. On the courts of Coney Island, where reputations are built one summer at a time, the kid earned a nickname before he earned a high school diploma. They called him Starbury. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a prophecy. The star the Marbury family had been waiting for. That kind of pressure, inherited, unasked for, threaded into your identity before you're old enough to choose, doesn't disappear when the lights get brighter. It compounds. Every contract, every trade demand, every public blow-up that the media would later reduce to the word selfish. The weight was always there underneath. He was never just playing for himself. He was playing for everyone who didn't make it out. At Abraham Lincoln High School in Brooklyn, Marbury became the best point guard New York City had seen in a generation. College scouts were there before he was a junior. By the time he committed to Georgia Tech, the trajectory was already set. 1 season with the Yellow Jackets, NCAA tournament, then the draft. 1996, Stephon Marbury is 19 years old. The Milwaukee Bucks select him 4th overall in the NBA draft. Then, before he plays a single professional game, before he laces up for a single practice, the Bucks trade him to the Minnesota Timberwolves. Most people don't pause on that detail. They should. The first transaction of Stephon Marbury's professional career was someone else deciding he belonged somewhere different. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't demanded anything. He was a teenager who had just achieved one of the hardest things in American sports, and the league's response was to immediately move him like a piece on a board. He landed in Minnesota alongside Kevin Garnett, 2 of the most gifted players of their generation, sharing the same court, the same city, the same impossible expectations. On paper, it looked like a dynasty in the making. But the NBA is not played on paper. 3 years later, Marbury would demand a trade out of Minnesota. The media would call it selfishness. They would say he couldn't play alongside another star, that he needed the ball too much, that he was, fundamentally, the problem. What they didn't say, what almost nobody said, is that the league had already shown him exactly how this worked. You are not a person here. You are a transaction. That lesson arrived on day one. He just hadn't learned to live with it yet. Between 1999 and 2004, Stephon Marbury became one of the most valuable point guards in professional basketball. Not almost, not arguably, objectively. After leaving Minnesota, he landed with the New Jersey Nets on a 6-year deal worth $70.9 million. Then Phoenix, a 4-year extension ranging between $76 and $80 million. Back-to-back All-Star selections, 2 All-NBA team honors, a player who averaged nearly 20 points and 8 assists per game, numbers that, at the time, put him in the conversation with the best in the league at his position. In Phoenix, under coach Frank Johnson, Marbury was at his sharpest. Explosive off the dribble. Creative in pick and roll. The kind of point guard who could take over a game before the other team had figured out what happened. His peak seasons with the Suns are what people forget when they tell the Stephon Marbury story. They skip straight to the Knicks, to the chaos, to the meltdown. But before any of that, this man could play. Then came the trade that was supposed to change everything. January 2004. The New York Knicks acquire Stephon Marbury from Phoenix. Madison Square Garden erupts. He was coming home. A kid from Coney Island, playing in the building he grew up watching on television, in the city that raised him, for the franchise that meant everything to New York basketball. The storyline wrote itself. The prodigal son returns. The Mecca gets its star. In his first half season with the Knicks, they made the playoffs. The dream felt real. It wouldn't stay real for long, but we'll get to that. Because in the middle of all this, somewhere between the contracts and the noise and the MSG spotlight, Stephon Marbury did something that almost no athlete at his level had ever done before. He tried to start a revolution. With a shoe. In 2006, Marbury partnered with discount retail chain Steve & Barry's to launch the Starbury line. The flagship shoe? $14.98. Let that land for a second. This was 2006. Nike Air Force Ones were selling for $80 to $100. Jordan brand sneakers were pushing $150 and above. The market had spent 2 decades convincing kids, especially kids in neighborhoods like Coney Island, that their worth on the court was tied to what they wore on their feet. That to be taken seriously, you needed to spend money you didn't have on shoes made by someone who'd never met you. Marbury had grown up in that world. He knew what it cost. Not the retail price, the actual cost, the pressure on parents, the kids who got robbed for their sneakers walking home, the quiet humiliation of showing up in the wrong pair. I don't want kids who look like me to not be able to play because they can't afford the shoes, he said at the time. The Starbury line sold millions of pairs. Independent tests by outlets that cut the shoe apart found the materials comparable to sneakers 3 to 4 times the price. Athletes wore them in pickup games. Parents wrote letters. For a brief, genuinely remarkable moment, it looked like Marbury had figured out how to use his platform for something larger than himself. Sports Illustrated put him on a list of good guys in sports 3 times. That's the part of the Stephon Marbury story that gets buried every time. But here's what nobody paid attention to in 2006. Steve & Barry's was not a healthy company. Behind the discount prices and rapid expansion was a business model drowning in debt. They were opening stores faster than they could sustain. Their entire operation was built on a financial structure that required constant growth just to survive. Marbury's shoe was attached to a company that was already dying. He didn't know that yet. In 2008, Steve and Barry's filed for bankruptcy and closed every single store. The Starbury brand, the Revolution, the $15 shoe, the letters from parents evaporated almost overnight. And by then, Marbury had much bigger problems waiting for him in New York. Here's something the Stephon Marbury narrative almost always gets wrong. The New York Knicks didn't fail because of Stephon Marbury. Stephon Marbury failed partly because of the New York Knicks. That distinction matters, and understanding it requires looking honestly at the organization he walked into in 2004. Not the mythology of Madison Square Garden, not the legacy. The actual institution, as it existed in that specific window of time. Because what Marbury walked into wasn't a basketball team with a complicated star. It was a dysfunction factory operating at full capacity, and he was the most expensive piece of machinery inside it. Isaiah Thomas became president of basketball operations for the Knicks in 2003. Within 5 years, he had assembled one of the most catastrophically mismanaged rosters in modern NBA history. Bad contracts stacked on top of bad contracts. Coaching changes that made no strategic sense. A front office that seemed to confuse activity with progress. Thomas clashed with head coach Larry Brown almost immediately after Brown was brought in for the 2005-06 season. The two men reportedly couldn't agree on anything: roster construction, rotations, philosophy, authority. Marbury was caught directly in the middle, feuding openly with Brown, while Thomas, his nominal ally, created a power structure that made coherent basketball nearly impossible. Brown was fired after one season, but still walked away with an $18.5 million settlement. Think about that number. The Knicks paid their fired coach $18.5 million to leave. This is the organization that would later publicly humiliate Marbury for being too expensive to keep. Thomas then took over as head coach himself, which meant Marbury was now playing for the same man who ran the front office that had built the broken team around him. The accountability loop was closed. There was no one left to complain to. In his final season under Thomas, Marbury averaged career lows in points and assists. Thomas removed him from the starting lineup. Their relationship, according to multiple reports, had deteriorated beyond repair. Marbury said at the time, "I've got so much stuff on Isaiah and he knows it." That sentence was treated as a threat. It was also a window into how poisonous that environment had become. But it wasn't only basketball that was unraveling. In 2005, Marbury was arrested for DUI in Arizona. His blood alcohol level registered more than double the legal limit. He was jailed for 10 days. The incident was covered, noted, and largely moved past because there were always more Knicks controversies waiting in line behind it. Then came the lawsuit. In 2006, former Knicks executive Anucha Brown Sanders filed a sexual harassment lawsuit against Madison Square Garden, James Dolan, and Isaiah Thomas. The trial in 2007 became a tabloid spectacle that consumed the entire organization. In court, Marbury was called to testify, and what came out pulled him directly into the story. He admitted to a sexual encounter with a Madison Square Garden intern following a night that included a strip club outing in 2005. The intern herself testified that the encounter was consensual. What the court established, however, was that the Knicks operated as what the jury formally described as a hostile work environment. The verdict: $11.6 million against Madison Square Garden and James Dolan. Marbury left the courthouse after his testimony, stepped into a crowded elevator, and said to no one in particular, "Money makes you do crazy things, man." Then he walked out smiling. Singing a song out loud. What is confirmed through court documents? Marbury was not a defendant in that case. What is also confirmed? His behavior was part of the evidence used to establish the organization's culture. The critical distinction that got lost in the coverage: he was a symptom as much as a cause. Around the same time, separate court papers revealed another affair. This one with his personal chef, Thariah Mitchell, whom Marbury had hired in January 2006. Mitchell alleged the relationship was coercive. Marbury maintained it was consensual, but offered her $900,000 to stay quiet. An arbitrator later ruled in Mitchell's favor, awarding her $330,000. December 2, 2007. The New York Knicks are playing the Phoenix Suns at Madison Square Garden. Don Marbury, Stephon's father, the man who worked his whole life so his youngest son could make it out of Coney Island, is in the stands watching his boy play. During the game, Don suffers a heart attack. His siblings, not wanting to alarm Stephon before the game ended, didn't tell him immediately. They assumed it would be okay, that everything would stabilize. Don Marbury passed away after the game. Stephon found out when it was already over. The man who had carried the weight of his entire family's dreams on his back. The weight that had defined every decision he ever made. Every trade demand. Every desperate attempt to prove something had been sitting in that building, watching, and was gone before Stephon even knew he needed to say goodbye. He played 8 games the rest of that season. Nobody asked why. The media noted his absence from the lineup. Isaiah Thomas, according to reports, had complicated feelings about Marbury's commitment. The narrative machine kept turning. What it didn't do, what it almost never does, was stop. Because the league doesn't stop for grief. The contracts don't stop. The obligations don't stop. And by the time the 2008-09 season arrived, Stephon Marbury was a different person than the one who had walked into Madison Square Garden with the crowd on its feet 4 years earlier. He just didn't know yet how much further he had left to fall. In April 2008, the New York Knicks fired Isaiah Thomas. For Stephon Marbury, this should have been a reset, a chance to start clean. The man he'd feuded with for years was gone. New leadership was coming in. Maybe, just maybe, this was where the story turned around. It didn't turn around. It accelerated straight off the edge. The Knicks hired Mike D'Antoni, the architect of the Phoenix Suns' 7 seconds or less offense, one of the most innovative coaching minds of his generation. D'Antoni was energetic, forward-thinking. The city was excited. D'Antoni also had a history with Marbury, a brief, uncomfortable one from Marbury's final days in Phoenix. Nothing explosive, just enough friction to make the temperature in the room slightly wrong from the beginning. That summer, the Knicks signed Chris Duhon as their starting point guard. Marbury showed up to training camp in shape. He competed for the starting job. He lost. D'Antoni told him he'd have a role approximately 35 minutes of playing time in certain games, but it would not be the role Marbury had held for the previous 4 years. To Marbury, this wasn't a role, it was a message. He gave me straight disrespect, Marbury told the New York Post. It was beyond disrespect. He put in Gallinari, whose back is messed up, ahead of me. That's saying I'm letting you have it right now. He was sticking it to me. D'Antoni heard the comments and responded with characteristic calm. I hate that. Obviously he's in a tough position, and I don't think anybody's thrilled with where anybody is. 2 men speaking past each other. An organization holding its breath. The Knicks' official position, stated publicly by President Donnie Walsh, was clear. They would not waive Marbury. They would not buy him out. They would not trade him. His $21.9 million salary made him essentially unmovable. And they would not let him play, unless injuries left them with no other options. They were going to pay Stephon Marbury $21 million to sit and watch. And that's exactly what they did. For weeks. November 26, 2008. The Knicks are in Detroit. They have 7 healthy players available. 7. Trades and injuries have stripped the roster down to the bone. D'Antoni approaches Marbury before the game. Asks him to suit up. Asks him to play. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask. D'Antoni said Marbury refused. Marbury said he never heard a direct order. The details of their conversation were disputed in the press for days. What is not disputed? Marbury did not play. The Knicks lost 110-96. And 2 days later, the organization came down hard. 1-game suspension. Nearly $400,000 docked from his salary. A public statement from Donnie Walsh that read, "A player's central obligation is to provide his professional services when called upon." Marbury earned $190,000 per game that season. The fine was not about the money. It was about the signal. His teammates heard it too. Quentin Richardson, asked about Marbury's refusal after the game, didn't soften anything. "I don't pay attention to him," Richardson said, "because I don't look at him as a teammate anyway." Think about that sentence. Not from a coach, not from management, from a teammate, a man who shared a locker room with him. Publicly, to reporters, during an active season. "I don't look at him as a teammate anyway." The locker room, the one place in professional sports where the mythology says men always stand together, had turned its back on him completely. Marbury responded in the press, "I sat there for 3 weeks and didn't say one word. I didn't hear one of my teammates say, 'Why isn't Stephon playing?' They left me out for dead. It's like we're in a foxhole and I'm facing the other way. If I got shot in the head, at least you want to get shot by the enemy." On December 1, 2008, Donnie Walsh issued a formal statement banning Marbury from attending practices or games until further notice. What followed was 3 months of public theater, with a man's livelihood and dignity at the center of it. The Knicks wanted a buyout. Marbury wanted his full contract honored. The gap between their positions was not just financial, it was philosophical. Marbury believed, not unreasonably, that he had not walked out on the team. The team had walked out on him. Why should he forfeit money because management decided they no longer wanted him? Walsh held firm. Marbury held firm. And while they negotiated, Marbury watched Knicks games from the stands, not from the bench. Not from the locker room, from the stands. Like a fan who happened to have a very good seat. He flew to Los Angeles and sat in the audience at a Lakers game. He watched a Warriors-Timberwolves game in Minneapolis. A man with a $21 million salary, banned from his own team, traveling to NBA arenas as a spectator. The images circulated. The commentary was merciless. On February 24, 2009, Marbury and the Knicks finally reached an agreement. He forfeited approximately $2 million from his contract. He was released. Within days, he signed with the Boston Celtics, the defending champions, for the stretch run. It looked, briefly, like a redemption arc. The Celtics lost in the second round. Marbury played limited minutes. His NBA career ended not with a moment, but with a quiet fade. No farewell. No acknowledgement. The league he had given 13 years to simply moved on to the next story. Then came the summer of 2009. And this is the part that requires you to set aside whatever you think you know about what happened. Because the version most people saw and the version that was actually happening were two completely different things. Stephon Barry's had filed for bankruptcy in 2008. Every store closed. The Starbury brand, the $15 shoe, the letters from parents, the genuine attempt to build something meaningful was gone. Not struggling, gone. Wells Fargo, formerly Wachovia, filed suit against Marbury for $16 million related to a real estate investment deal gone wrong. A follow-up suit for an additional $3 million came in 2012. The legal fees alone were staggering. The contracts had stopped. The brand had collapsed. The lawsuits were stacking up. The city that had once put him on a pedestal had officially declared him, in the words of the New York Daily News, the most reviled athlete in town. In July 2009, Stephon Marbury sat alone and turned on a camera. He live-streamed himself for nearly 24 hours. He answered questions from strangers on the internet. He wept openly. At one point, he ate Vaseline, later explaining it was a home remedy for a sore throat. The internet did what the internet does. Clips spread. Memes were made. Sports radio spent a week treating it as comedy. Another athlete losing his mind. Another cautionary tale. Another reminder of what happens when ego outgrows talent. That's what the world saw. Here's what was actually happening. Years later, in a 2015 interview with HBO's Real Sports, Marbury finally said it plainly. "I wanted to kill myself some days. I did. It wasn't about basketball. It started to become about me, because I was that depressed and I was that sick." His wife Latasha described him lying in bed all day, eating fruity pebbles, unable to move. Not performing. Not seeking attention. Disappearing. He had lost his father. Lost his career. Lost his brand. Lost his teammates. Lost his city. And when he finally broke visibly, publicly, undeniably, the response from the world that had consumed his highlights for 13 years was laughter. Not one major outlet asked the obvious question, why is he crying? Because the machine that had built Stephon Marbury into a commodity had no infrastructure for what happened when the commodity stopped performing. No protocol for grief. No framework for mental health. No mechanism for catching someone on the way down. Just cameras. And clicks. And people moving on to the next story. Stephon Marbury had made over $150 million in the NBA. In the summer of 2009, he was alone in a room, wanting to die, and the world was laughing at him. That is the fall. Not the contract dispute, not the Vaseline, not the memes. The fall is what it costs a person to be treated as a product for their entire adult life, and then discarded the moment the product stops selling. In January 2010, Stephon Marbury received an email. It was from the Shanxi Brave Dragons, a team in China's basketball association that most American sports fans had never heard of. The offer was simple. Come play basketball in China. The salary was a fraction of what he'd made in the NBA. The country was on the other side of the world. The language was one he didn't speak. The culture was one he knew nothing about. His knowledge of China, by his own admission, began and ended with two things: Yao Ming and the Great Wall. He almost said no. And then he thought about the alternative, the empty days, the lawsuits, the silence where a career used to be, and he said yes. That decision, made without fanfare, without a press conference, without anyone in America paying much attention, would turn out to be the most important of his life. When Marbury landed at Taiyuan Airport in Shanxi Province, something unexpected happened. There were fans waiting for him. Not a handful. Not a polite welcoming committee. Hundreds of people who had come specifically to see this man that American sports media had spent the last year treating as a cautionary tale. They held signs. They chanted. They pressed forward just to be near him. Marbury stood at that airport and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Wanted. The transformation that followed wasn't instant. His first season with Shanxi was a recalibration. Relearning how to play without the weight of New York on his back. Without the feuds. Without the tabloid cameras pointed at his every move. He moved to Foshan briefly, then signed with the Beijing Ducks. The Shougang Beijing Ducks in 2011. And that's where everything changed. In Beijing, Marbury did something that almost no high-profile American athlete playing abroad had ever done. He didn't treat it like an exile. He didn't count the days until he could go home. He didn't demand the privileges that foreign stars typically extracted from Chinese clubs. Private drivers, separate hotels, special meal arrangements, first-class travel while teammates flew economy. He took the subway. The actual Beijing subway, elbow to elbow with commuters, the same as everyone else. He flew economy with the team. He ate in the canteen. He learned phrases in Mandarin. He opened a social media account on Sina Weibo, China's equivalent of Twitter, and replied personally to fans. Thousands of messages. He wrote a weekly column for China Daily. For a man who had been called the most reviled athlete in his hometown, he was remarkably good at making people feel like he was one of them. The basketball followed. The 2011-12 season. Beijing Ducks opened 13-0. In the playoff series against Shaanxi, Marbury averages 45 points per game. The Ducks reached the CBA Finals against the Guangdong Southern Tigers, 7-time champions, the most dominant dynasty in Chinese basketball history. Beijing wins. First championship in the franchise's 19-year history. In May 2012, a bronze statue of Stephon Marbury is unveiled outside the MasterCard Center, the arena built for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Dennis Rodman attends the ceremony. 18,000 fans fill the building. The man who had been banned from his own team's practices 3 years earlier now had a monument erected in his honor in the capital city of the world's most populous nation. 2 more championships followed, 2014, then 2015, when Marbury was named Finals MVP at age 38. In 2015, the Chinese government granted him permanent residency, a green card in the informal translation. He was only the 5th American basketball player in history to receive one. A year later, the Beijing government named him an honorary citizen, placing him alongside former IOC president Jacques Rogge and Hong Kong billionaire Li Ka-shing on a list of 30 people who had contributed meaningfully to the city. A museum, a postal stamp, a key to the city. A movie about his life, My Other Home, released in Chinese theaters. The man America had discarded had become, in the fullest possible sense, irreplaceable somewhere else. But here's what the redemption arc can obscure if you let it. The fact that Marbury rebuilt his life in China doesn't mean the collapse was inevitable. It doesn't mean the system worked. It doesn't mean everyone who falls that far finds a Shaanxi Brave Dragons email waiting in their inbox. So let's be precise about what actually failed. Failure number 1. The NBA's transaction machine. Stephon Marbury was traded before he played his first professional game. He was traded 4 more times across his career. Each trade was framed publicly as a basketball decision. None of them were accompanied by any institutional support for what it means to uproot a person's life repeatedly, on someone else's timeline, for someone else's reasons. When his father died in the stands at Madison Square Garden, the league's schedule did not pause. His contractual obligations did not pause. The expectation that he would perform did not pause. There is no version of that story where the system around him was functioning as it should. Failure number 2. The Knicks organization. A federal jury in 2007 formally determined that Madison Square Garden operated as a hostile work environment. That is not an opinion. That is a legal finding. Marbury played the most consequential years of his career inside an institution that a court of law said did not meet basic standards of professional conduct. The dysfunction that surrounded him, the coaching carousel, the Thomas era, the public humiliations, was not incidental to his decline. It was the environment that produced it. Failure number 3. The media. The New York Daily News called him the most reviled athlete in town. Sports Illustrated named him the most undesirable teammate. When he live-streamed himself crying and eating Vaseline in the summer of 2009, the coverage was almost universally contemptuous. Not one major outlet in the immediate aftermath framed it as what it actually was: a man in mental health crisis, publicly, in real time. The machine that had monetized his highlights for 13 years had no interest in monetizing his suffering, only in mocking it. Failure number 4. The people closest to him. This one is harder to say, but the same entourage structure that consumed athletes like Allen Iverson quietly surrounded Marbury too. People with financial interests in his continued spending. People who had every incentive to tell him what he wanted to hear and none to tell him the truth. When the Knicks' situation deteriorated, almost no one in his inner circle had the standing or the courage to say, "This isn't worth it. Walk away." And then there is the final failure, the one Marbury himself has acknowledged most directly. He made choices that hurt people. The affairs, the hush money, the refusal to play when teammates needed him on the floor. These are not excused by the failures of the system around him. He was a grown man with agency, and some of what happened was the direct result of decisions he made. "I did something that men did," he told The New Yorker in 2020, "and I paid for it." No deflection, no victimhood, just a man accounting honestly for his own part in the wreckage. That accounting matters, because the most accurate version of this story is not Stephon Marbury was destroyed by forces beyond his control. And it's not Stephon Marbury destroyed himself through selfishness and poor choices. It's both, simultaneously. The way it almost always is when a person's life comes apart at this scale. Systems fail people, and people fail themselves. And sometimes those two things happen at the exact same time, in the exact same place, and nobody stops to figure out which came first. So what really happened to Stephon Marbury? It wasn't the ego. It wasn't the contracts. It wasn't even the Knicks. Here's what it was. Coney Island taught Stephon Marbury one thing above everything else. Basketball is survival. Carry your family. Don't show weakness. Your value is what you produce on the court. That lesson got him out of the projects. It got him to the NBA. It got him $150 million. And then it destroyed him. Because nobody, not the league, not the Knicks, not the media, not the people closest to him, ever replaced that lesson with something more complete. Something that accounted for grief, for betrayal, for the specific loneliness of being publicly discarded by the city that raised you. The system took everything he had, and when there was nothing left to take, it moved on. Today, Stephon Marbury is 48 years old. His net worth sits around $40 million real, lasting wealth built largely in a country he once knew nothing about. In 2023, he and Latasha divorced after 21 years of marriage. In April 2025, he married Chinese singer Wang Yuling in Philadelphia. He still lives in Beijing. The statue is still standing. In America, people remember him for the Vaseline video. In China, they remember him for what he did after. That gap between how a country discards someone and how another country receives them is the real story. Not the $120 million, not the scandals, not the meltdown. The real story is simpler and sadder than any of that. Stephon Marbury just needed someone to catch him. He had to fly 10,000 miles to find them.